The parking garage on Court Street was nearly empty when I pulled in that morning, 40 minutes before sunrise. I sat in the car for a moment with both hands still on the wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. On the passenger seat lay a worn brown leather folder, the leather gone soft and pale at the corners from 24 years of use. I'd carried it into war zones. I carried it into rooms where generals waited to hear whether their careers would survive the next hour. Today I was carrying it into a courtroom in Onslow County, North Carolina, to fight for the only thing that had ever mattered more than any of that. "Rank isn't who you are," I said quietly to no one. "It's just a job you once had." I'd said that sentence to myself so many times over the past 3 years that it had worn smooth, like a stone in a pocket. I needed it smooth this morning. I needed it to slide easily past the fear sitting in my chest. My name is Diane Hutchins. I am 47 years old, and until 3 years ago I wore the silver eagle of a United States Marine Corps colonel on my collar. Most people who know me now have no idea. That has always been exactly how I wanted it. I got out of the car, locked it, and walked 3 blocks toward the Onslow County Courthouse, the leather folder tucked under one arm like it had been tucked there 1,000 times before. I stopped at a small coffee shop I'd been visiting for years. Black coffee, no sugar, old habit. Then I walked the rest of the way in the gray early light, past the flags already stirring outside the courthouse doors, and up the steps. Inside courtroom 3B, my mother-in-law was already seated at the petitioner's table, and when she turned and saw me walking in alone, she smiled the way people smile when they believe they've already won. She actually came by herself, Eleanor Hutchins said to her son, not quite quietly enough. A few people behind her turned to look. One man shook his head slightly, as if he'd already seen how the morning would end. I set my folder down at the respondent's table and took my seat. Eleanor leaned forward. "You couldn't even afford an attorney?" I met her eyes. "I'm exactly where I need to be." She laughed, soft and satisfied. "So you're representing yourself?" "I am." Across the aisle, her attorney, Gregory Vance, adjusted his tie with the easy competence of a man expecting a short morning and an easier win. I'd read enough about him in the weeks before this hearing to know his reputation. Aggressive. Well-prepared, usually. Expensive, always. The bailiff's voice cut through the low murmur of the room. "All rise." I stood, the way I had stood in 100 courtrooms before this one, spine straight, hands loosely folded. Judge Thomas Whitfield entered through the side door, arranging a stack of files as he crossed to the bench. He glanced up, and for just a moment, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, quiet and unmistakable. "Good morning, Colonel Hutchins." Every sound in the room seemed to disappear at once. I watched Eleanor's smile fade so quickly it almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. I lived in a modest brick ranch house on the edge of Jacksonville, North Carolina, close enough to Marine Corps Air Station New River that some mornings you could hear the low, distant thrum of rotors lifting off before dawn. My days followed a rhythm that had become sacred to me in the way only ordinary things become sacred after loss. Coffee before sunrise. Feed our dog Duke, an aging yellow lab who greeted every morning like it was the first one he'd ever seen. Wake my 12-year-old daughter, Grace, for school. Drive past the elementary school she'd long since outgrown while she finished a breakfast sandwich in the passenger seat, backpack at her feet. It wasn't a glamorous life. It never needed to be. After 24 years of deployments and relocations and packing our lives into moving boxes every 18 months, an ordinary Tuesday morning had become the single luxury I valued more than any promotion I'd ever earned. Grace didn't remember much of the moving box years. To her, this house, this street, this school had simply always been home, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as it was mine to protect. Normal routines were comforting after everything we'd been through. Rob had loved routines too. Grace had my dark hair and her father's easy laugh when she let herself use it. Her father, Robert Hutchins, everyone called him Rob, had been a Marine Corps MV-22 Osprey pilot. We met at a legal briefing on base of all places back when I was a young captain, freshly commissioned into the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and still uncertain whether I'd made the right choice leaving the enlisted world behind. He'd been sitting in the back row of a room full of officers half listening to a briefing on operational law, and afterward he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said no. Twice. The third time he asked, he just smiled and said, "I'll keep asking until the answer changes." It did, eventually. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony that Eleanor, to her credit, helped plan with genuine enthusiasm back then, before grief rewrote everything between us. Rob never pushed me to discuss the details of my work. Some evenings I'd come home exhausted after a full day buried in the case I couldn't leave at the office no matter how hard I tried, and he'd hand me a glass of iced tea and ask, "Want silence? Or conversation?" Usually silence. He respected that without ever making me feel like I owed him an explanation for needing it. When Grace was born, everything shifted in the quiet, permanent way it does for every parent. The Marine Corps remained my career. She became my reason. As I advanced through the ranks, the responsibilities grew heavier, the cases grew harder, and eventually, after 17 years as a JAG officer, I pinned on the silver eagles of a full colonel. It remains one of the proudest moments of my life. Rob stood beside me in his own dress blues, and Grace, only 9 years old at the time, saluted me with complete seriousness before dissolving into giggles halfway through. That photograph sat on my dresser until the day Rob died. After the funeral, I packed it away with everything else. Not because I'd stopped loving the memory it held, but because every time I looked at it, I remembered exactly what we'd lost. And some days I simply couldn't afford to remember that clearly and still get Grace to school on time. Rob used to joke that military families survived because someone always knew what came next. Then one Tuesday morning, 3 years ago, nothing came next. Rob died during a training exercise near MCAS New River. The investigation ruled it an accident, a mechanical failure no one could have predicted or prevented. That ruling didn't make it any easier to explain to a 9-year-old girl why her father wasn't coming home. It also didn't make things easier with Rob's parents. At first, Eleanor and Walter Hutchins seemed like exactly what we needed. They brought casseroles. They hugged Grace until she squirmed. They cried with me at the small military cemetery outside town while Marines in dress blues folded the flag into a tight triangle and placed it in my hands. For a few months, I honestly believed grief had pulled us closer together. I couldn't have been more wrong. About 6 months after the funeral, Eleanor began making comments. Small ones, at first. They never should have let him fly those missions. You always encouraged him to stay in. If he'd taken that job with the airline in Charlotte, he'd still be alive. She never said the real sentence out loud. She didn't have to. Every comment carried the same accusation underneath it. You took my son away from me. I let it go. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that grief could twist good people into saying cruel things. Or at least, I wanted to believe that. Over time, the comments sharpened. When Grace wanted to spend weekends with her grandparents, Eleanor began questioning everything about how I raised her. Why wasn't Grace in private school? Why hadn't I bought a bigger house? Why was I still driving a 6-year-old Honda instead of something newer? She loved comparing me to Rob's older brother Craig and his wife, who'd done very well for themselves in Raleigh. "They've really built something," Eleanor would say, letting the sentence trail off into the obvious comparison she never had to finish. The truth was, I could have afforded a bigger house. I could have driven whatever I wanted. Between my pension, Rob's survivor benefits, and years of careful saving, Grace and I were more than comfortable. I simply didn't care about appearances the way Eleanor did. After I retired from the Marine Corps, I'd taken a quiet position as legal counsel for a nonprofit that helped veterans navigate benefits disputes, housing issues, and employment claims. The pay wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. One Sunday after church, Eleanor stood in my kitchen while I made grilled cheese sandwiches for Grace. "You know," she said, watching me butter another slice of bread, "Robert always deserved more." I didn't look up. "He deserved a long life." She sighed, the theatrical kind. "I meant financially." "I know what you meant." She smiled politely and let the conversation die there. But I noticed Grace listening from the dining room, and that bothered me far more than anything Eleanor could have said directly to my face. Over the following 2 years, things steadily worsened. Eleanor started telling relatives I'd become emotionally unstable. She told neighbors I barely left the house. At Thanksgiving one year, she announced to the entire table that I had been, in her words, some kind of military office worker. A clerk, wasn't it? I passed the mashed potatoes without a word. For half a second, out of pure habit, I reached for Rob's hand under the table before I remembered he wasn't there. Old habits linger long after the person connected to them is gone. I quietly withdrew my hand and picked up my glass of tea instead. "No," I said, "I wasn't a clerk." Eleanor laughed. "Oh, right. legal administration, or whatever you call it, if that's what you'd like to believe. She rolled her eyes. You always were so private. There's a difference between private and mysterious, I said. I've just never needed anyone's approval badly enough to explain myself. Very few people outside the Marine Corps knew exactly what I'd spent 24 years doing. Even Rob, in the early years, never pushed hard for details. He understood classified casework the way only someone inside the system could. He'd simply ask, "Hard day?" and sometimes I'd nod, and sometimes he'd wrap an arm around me without another question. Those quiet moments were enough for both of us. After he died, I packed away every plaque, every photo and dress blues, every commendation letter into storage bins in the garage. Not because I was ashamed of any of it, because I wanted Grace growing up with a mother, not a retired officer whose past cast a long shadow over the present. To me, those had never been the same job. I want to be honest about something else, because it matters to how this story unfolds. My silence about my career wasn't really about secrecy. It never had to be. Most of what I did in the Marine Corps wasn't classified in any meaningful sense. Court-martial proceedings are public record more often than people assume. What was mine to keep private was the choice not to lead with it. Eleanor never asked a real question and waited for a real answer. She built an entire narrative out of the silence I left behind, and when it was finally filled in, she discovered it was never as mysterious as she'd needed it to be. I joined the Marine Corps at 19, straight out of high school in a small town outside Wilmington, enlisted, not commissioned. I spent 4 years as a legal clerk in a base legal office, filing motions and organizing case binders, watching JAG officers work cases I didn't yet have the credentials to touch. I used to stay late just to read the closed files, trying to understand how a good attorney built an argument that couldn't be knocked down. A major named Patricia Osei noticed how carefully I read those files on my own time. She called me into her office one afternoon, closed the door, and asked me a question nobody in my family had ever thought to ask. "What do you actually want to do with your life, Corporal?" I told her the truth, that I didn't fully know yet, only that I wanted to be in the room where the hard decisions got made instead of just carrying the paperwork afterward. She nominated me for the Marine Corps' funded law education program that same month. The Corps paid for law school. I paid it back in years of service, the way you always do. I was commissioned as a JAG officer at 27, walking into my first courtroom still half convinced someone would realize the mistake and send me back to the filing room. No one did. Over the following 17 years, I built a career prosecuting the hardest cases the Corps had to offer. Fraud that gutted unit budgets. Abuse cases that took months to build and years to stop replaying in my head after the verdict came down. And one case, the one Marcus Alvarez would later mention on a witness stand in a courtroom, neither of us could have imagined at the time. That nearly ended my career for reasons that had nothing to do with the evidence and everything to do with whose staff the evidence pointed toward. I prosecuted it anyway, 24 years total. Colonel by 43. Retired at 44. A decision I made in the raw, disoriented months after Rob died, when I realized I couldn't keep doing both jobs, the uniform and the mother, and give either one what it deserved. None of that made me a mystery. It only made me someone who'd learned, the hard way, that the people who mattered didn't need the resume, and the people who demanded it usually weren't asking for the right reasons. 6 weeks before the hearing, a certified envelope arrived. Inside was a petition filed in Onslow County District Court. Rob's parents wanted custody of Grace. They claimed I was emotionally unfit. They alleged I isolated Grace from extended family. They questioned my financial judgment. Then came the part that genuinely stunned me. They also challenged my management of Rob's survivor benefits and asked the court to appoint a financial conservator over the estate. I read the paperwork twice, then a third time. Finally, I laughed, not because any of it was funny, but because it was so completely disconnected from the child I actually knew. Grace was thriving. Honor roll. Travel, soccer. Church youth group. Weekly counseling, which she'd asked for herself after Rob died and which I'd never once missed. Her pediatrician described her as remarkably resilient for everything she'd been through. Still, court is court. Facts don't always speak loudly enough on their own. I knew Eleanor had hired one of the region's most expensive family law attorneys, a man named Gregory Vance, who reportedly won almost everything he touched. Friends urged me to hire someone equally aggressive. I thanked them and declined. There was a reason for that, beyond stubbornness. My old law school friend, Rebecca Ford, now a partner at a firm in Wilmington, sat across from me at our kitchen table 2 weeks before the hearing, going through my exhibits line by line. "You could hire me," she said, "not for the first time." "I could," I agreed. "But you know I won't." She studied me for a long moment. "You know what they say. A lawyer who represents herself has a fool for a client." "That's true for most lawyers," I said. "It's not true for someone who spent 17 years cross-examining people exactly like Gregory Vance's witnesses." Rebecca closed the folder in front of her and smiled, the kind of smile that carried real respect in it. "You're the best trial counsel in our graduating class. If I sat next to you at that table, I'd just be in your way." "You'll be there anyway," I said. "In the gallery. Try to stop me." In the weeks before the hearing, I did what I'd done for 24 years before any trial that mattered. I built the case the way it was supposed to be built. I submitted my witness list and exhibit list on time, exactly as the pre-trial scheduling order required, no later filings, no surprises smuggled in at the last minute. Marcus Alvarez and Chaplain Grant both agreed weeks in advance to testify, once I called and asked them directly, and both names appeared on the filed list Vance's office received along with everyone else's. I wanted the record to reflect what I already knew about myself, that I didn't need to ambush anyone to win on the truth. There was one more detail I noticed while preparing that week, one I filed away and didn't mention to anyone. The judge assigned to the case was Thomas Whitfield. The name was familiar in a way that took me a full day to place. Years earlier, before he'd taken the bench in civilian court, Whitfield had served as a Navy JOG officer, and I recalled, vaguely, the way you recall the edges of a memory, rather than its center, presenting a case summary once before a joint military legal review board where a Navy captain named Whitfield had asked sharp, exacting questions. It might have been him. It might not have been. I decided not to build any hope on a maybe. I did mention it to Rebecca once, almost in passing. She looked up from the exhibit binder she was organizing. "If it is him," she said carefully, "you know that alone isn't grounds for him to step aside. Knowing someone professionally, years ago, in a completely different context, doesn't create a conflict. He'd only need to recuse himself if there were an actual basis to question his impartiality. I know how recusal works, Rebecca. I know you do," she smiled. I just wanted to hear myself say it out loud. Made me feel useful. "You are useful. You're just not allowed to sit at my table." Cruelest thing anyone said to me all year. But I didn't forget it either. By the time Judge Whitfield's voice broke the silence following his greeting, the entire courtroom had shifted its attention toward me. Eleanor stared, then looked toward Vance, then back at me, waiting for someone to explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding. No one did. Whitfield adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the docket. "Counsel, are both parties ready to proceed?" Vance cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." Whitfield looked toward me. "Mrs. Hutchins?" "Colonel Hutchins is fine, Your Honor, but Mrs. Hutchins works too." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. Even Whitfield allowed the corner of his mouth to lift before his expression returned to something more measured. "Very well, let's proceed." Vance stood for his opening, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried motion of a man who delivered 100 openings before this one and expected this to feel exactly the same. He described me as isolated, secretive, emotionally distant. He leaned heavily on my military background, framing it less as service and more as a kind of armor I'd use to keep my own family at arm's length. "Your Honor," he said, pacing a slow half-circle in front of the bench, "this is a case about a little girl who deserves more than the narrow, guarded world her mother has built around her. Eleanor and Walter Hutchins are not asking this court to punish anyone. They are asking this court to recognize that a child thrives with more love around her, not less, and that the respondent's need for privacy has come quite literally, at the expense of her daughter's relationships with the only extended family she has left. It was a well-built opening, I'll admit that much." Vance had a gift for making an assumption sound like a settled fact simply by saying it slowly and looking the judge in the eye while he said it. I'd built openings exactly like it myself, years earlier in rooms where the stakes ran considerably higher than a custody dispute. I recognized the architecture of it even as I sat there absorbing the sting of hearing my daughter's life described as narrow and guarded by a man who had met her exactly 0 times. "Mrs. Perchin." Hutchins has struggled to maintain healthy relationships, he said, because of experiences she refuses to discuss. Interesting strategy. He was trying to turn my privacy into evidence of instability. I'd expected that. What surprised me, listening to him, was realizing that Eleanor had probably believed every word of her own narrative. She'd mistaken silence for secrecy because she'd never once tried the alternative. Whitfield turned toward me. Mrs. Brumman. Hutchins, any response before we proceed to witnesses? I stood. My response will come through evidence rather than speeches, Your Honor. He nodded. Very well. Vance called Eleanor first. She walked to the stand with the same confidence she'd carried into the room that morning, took the oath, and settled into the chair like she'd rehearsed the movement in a mirror. Mrs. Byrne. Hutchins, Vance began, why are you asking this court for custody of your granddaughter? Eleanor glanced toward Grace, seated quietly beside Major Yvonne Park, 2 rows back, before answering. Because I love her. No objection. Love wasn't in dispute. And why do you believe Diane is unable to provide the stability Grace needs? Ever since my son died, she's become withdrawn. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She isolates Grace from us. Can you explain? She rarely brings Grace to family gatherings anymore. I wrote 1 word on my legal pad. Rarely, not never. Words matter. She keeps secrets, Eleanor continued. What kind of secrets? I honestly don't know. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. Even Eleanor seemed to hear how that sounded. I mean, she hurried to explain, she never tells anyone anything. I don't know where she goes. I don't know who she talks to. I don't know what she really did in the Marine Corps. She looked toward me. For years, I believed she handled paperwork. Apparently, I was wrong. Did Diane ever intentionally mislead your family? I believe she did. How? By pretending to be ordinary. The sentence sat awkwardly in the air. Whitfield glanced over his glasses, and Vance, wisely, changed direction. Has Grace ever expressed fear around her mother? No. That answer surprised me, and it was honest of Eleanor to give it without hesitation. Has Diane ever struck Grace? No. Neglected her? No. Neglected her? No. Failed to provide food, housing, education, medical care? No. So your concern isn't abuse? No. Then what is it? Eleanor's voice dropped, quiet and almost fragile. She isn't emotionally available. There it was. The real accusation, not something measurable, a feeling wearing the shape of a legal claim. Vance finished his direct examination. Your witness. I stood, carrying only a yellow legal pad, and walked toward the stand. No dramatic pause. No performance. Just another conversation, the kind I'd had 1,000 times before in rooms far more hostile than this one. Good afternoon. Eleanor shifted. Hello. I only have a few questions. I opened my pad. You testified we've grown distant. Yes. How many times have you asked to see Grace during the past 12 months? She frowned. I don't remember. I do. I glanced at my notes. 23 invitations extended to you and Walter. You accepted 6. You declined 17. Vance stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. I'll gladly provide the supporting emails and text messages, Your Honor, I said without turning. Overruled, Whitfield said. I handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to Vance's table. Eleanor stared at the papers. You were invited for Thanksgiving. Silence. For Grace's school concert. Silence. For her birthday. I was on a cruise. A few quiet laughs from the gallery. Not mocking, just human. The recognition that runs through a room when someone's excuse falls apart in front of them. You also testified that I isolate Grace, I continued. Does Grace play travel soccer? Yes. Attend church youth group? Yes. Go to sleepovers with friends? Yes. Go to sleepovers with friends? Yes. Make honor roll? Yes. Attend weekly counseling since losing her father? Yes. Counseling that you personally recommended to me? Eleanor hesitated. Yes. I smiled gently. Thank you. She shifted in her seat, the confidence from that morning fading visibly. I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I wanted the facts to stand where the assumptions had been. Then I asked the question I'd been saving. Eleanor, when Robert was alive, how many times did you ask him what I actually did in the Marine Corps? She blinked. Once. 5 times, according to the messages I have. But let's say once is accurate. What did he tell you? He said it was complicated. And did you ask a follow-up question? No. You assumed instead. I suppose I did. You never asked me directly either. No. So if you misunderstood my career for over a decade, I said quietly, that wasn't because I lied to you. She swallowed. No. Thank you. Nothing further. I returned to my table. No flourish. No raised voice. Just the truth, sitting there where everyone could see it. Vance stood for redirect and then paused, looking down at his notes before looking back up, uncertain for the first time all day. He asked Eleanor only 3 brief questions before excusing her from the stand. The next witness was our neighbor, Denise Coleman, who'd lived across the street from Grace and me for nearly 6 years. I genuinely liked Denise, which made seeing her name on the witness list painful. Mrs. Coleman, Vance began, have you observed Diane keeping to herself? She's private, Denise said. Does she socialize often? Not really, no. Thank you. I approached slowly. Denise. She smiled nervously. Hi, Diane. We've borrowed sugar from each other before, haven't we? She laughed more than once, countless times. You've watched Duke when Grace and I traveled. Yes, and I've watched her grandkids. You have. When your water heater burst last spring, you helped me clean out the whole basement, brought your own shop vac. When Frank had his knee replacement, you drove him to physical therapy twice a week for a month. I folded my hands. So, when you described me as private? Yes. You didn't mean unfriendly, no. Denise smiled warmly. I meant you don't gossip, you don't talk about yourself, but you show up every single time, whether anyone asks you to or not. The courtroom laughed softly. Even Whitfield allowed a small smile. Vance closed his eyes for half a second. He hadn't expected that answer. Neither had Eleanor. Late that afternoon, Vance called his final witness for the petitioners. Your Honor, we call Craig Hutchins. Craig walked to the stand with the easy confidence of a man who'd rehearsed every movement. Perfect haircut, tailored suit, the kind of polish that never seemed to sweat even in a warm North Carolina courtroom. Rob used to joke that his brother never entered a conversation without an exit plan already mapped out. It wasn't really a joke. Mr. Hutchins, Vance said, how would you describe Diane's relationship with your family since your brother passed? It changed, Craig said. She slowly pushed us away. Did that concern you? It did. Grace lost her father. I didn't want her losing her grandparents too. A reasonable answer, measured. Exactly the kind of testimony judges hear every day. Vance introduced a stack of printed text messages. I'd like to enter Petitioner's Exhibit 12. The pages were handed to Whitfield, then to me. I recognized the conversation immediately, exchanges between Craig and me from over a year earlier. Something felt wrong the moment I scanned the first page. Messages were missing. Not. Altered. Removed. Any objection? Whitfield asked. Not to authenticity, Your Honor, I said, standing. To completeness. Explain. This conversation has been selectively printed. Vance frowned. They're accurate representations. I didn't say they weren't accurate, I said. I said they're incomplete. Whitfield folded his hands. Do you have the full exchange? I do. I reached into my folder and pulled out a second packet. I anticipated this. The bailiff distributed the copies. Whitfield compared the 2 versions, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he moved through the pages. Several messages appeared in mine that hadn't made it into Vance's exhibit. One read, Craig, Mom's upset. Give her a little time. My response, of course, tell her she's welcome for dinner next Sunday. Grace misses everyone. Another, Craig, sorry, we're heading to the coast that weekend. Maybe next month? Another, Diane, Grace's school play is Friday. We'd love to have you all there. No response ever sent. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that filled the whole room. Counsel, Whitfield said, looking toward Vance. Vance stood quickly. Your Honor, I was provided only the documents my clients supplied. I understand, Whitfield said, his voice calm but firm. The court prefers complete conversations, so do I. I turned toward Craig for the first time that afternoon. He looked uneasy, shifting in the chair. Good afternoon, Craig. He forced a smile. Diane, we've known each other almost 18 years. That's right. You've always considered yourself an honest person. I try to be. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. The admission seemed to surprise him, and it relaxed him a little, the way people relax when they don't expect an attack. I only have a few questions. I glanced at my notes. You testified I stopped communicating. Did I invite your family to Grace's 10th birthday? Yes. Her 6th grade graduation? Yes. Christmas dinner? Yes. Christmas dinner? Yes, you declined. We had other plans. Every time. He hesitated. Mostly. Do you remember calling me last October? I do. You asked whether Grace could stay with you and your wife for a weekend. Yes. What did I say? He looked down at his hands. You agreed. Right away. Without hesitation? Yes. So I trusted you enough to let my daughter come stay with you. Yes. Does that sound like someone trying to destroy the family? He didn't answer. Whitfield looked over. You may answer or decline, your choice. No, Craig said quietly. It doesn't. I paused, then asked the question I'd been holding for last. Craig, who suggested filing this lawsuit? His eyes shifted toward the gallery, toward his mother, then back down. My mother did. Did you think it was a good idea? A long silence stretched through the room. No, he finally said, barely above a whisper. Eleanor's face drained of color. I told you we shouldn't do this, Craig said, turning toward her before anyone could stop him. You said Diane would never fight back. You said she'd just settle to avoid the mess. Craig, Eleanor whispered sharply. I thought you were wrong, he said, but by the time I said anything, it was already too late. A murmur moved through the gallery. Whitfield allowed it to settle before speaking. We'll take a 15-minute recess. I stepped out into the hallway, needing air that didn't carry the weight of the room behind me. The courthouse windows overlooked the street, where county employees crossed the sidewalk carrying lunch. A normal afternoon continuing outside while mine felt suspended somewhere else entirely. Down the hall, on a bench near the vending machines, Grace sat beside Major Yvonne Park, working through a worksheet of math problems as though it were any ordinary Tuesday. Yvonne had served with me years earlier, back when she was a young lieutenant and I was still learning how to run a courtroom without my voice shaking. She'd left active duty a few years after I did and now worked as a family readiness officer at the air station, which was a fortunate coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence at all, since I'd specifically asked her to be the one Grace stayed with whenever the hearing required stepping away from the gallery. How's she doing? I asked quietly. Better than you'd think, Yvonne said. She asked me twice if you were winning. I told her you don't play a game like this to win. You play it to be right, and then everyone else has to catch up. That's a very generous way of putting it. Grace looked up from her worksheet. Mom, is it almost done? Almost, sweetheart. A little while longer. Okay. She went back to her math without a trace of the anxiety I'd feared she might be carrying. Whatever fear existed in that hallway belonged entirely to me. I leaned against the wall near them for a moment and closed my eyes. For just a second, I wasn't in Onslow County anymore. I was back in a different courtroom, years earlier, a different family waiting for a different verdict. A mother who would never see her son again sitting exactly where I now stood. Those memories never fully disappear. You just learn where to keep them, Colonel. I opened my eyes. Marcus Alvarez stood a few feet away, older now, more gray at his temples, still carrying himself with the same straight-backed bearing he'd had as a young NCIS agent nearly 2 decades earlier. Marcus, it's been too long, Diane. It has. We'd worked together for close to 8 years, interviewing hundreds of witnesses side by side across cases that ranged from routine fraud to the kind of investigations that kept people up at night. I heard your name on today's docket, he said. Figured I'd come by since you finally called and asked. I appreciate you making the drive. Wouldn't have missed it. The bailiff stepped into the hallway. Mrs. Hutchins? The judge has approved your witness request. Marcus glanced at me. You're finally going to use me. I didn't want to, I admitted. But I have to. Back inside, I called my first witness. The respondent calls Marcus Alvarez. He took the oath and settled into the chair. Mr. Alvarez, I began. How do we know each other? We worked together for almost 8 years while you served as trial counsel and senior prosecutor. I was assigned as an NCIS special agent supporting several of your investigations. What kinds of cases? He took a slow breath. The hardest ones. Fraud involving senior officers, abuse cases. One corruption investigation that reached into a general's staff. The courtroom went quiet. Eleanor looked completely lost. Did you ever observe me decline to pursue a case because the accused held a high rank? No, he said. In fact, quite the opposite. You prosecuted a 2-star general when everyone around you advised against it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Vance stood. Objection. Relevance. It goes directly to my character for honesty and integrity, I said, which the petition has directly challenged. Overruled, Whitfield said. Marcus continued. Diane lost at least one promotion opportunity because she refused to bend to political pressure on that case. She did what was right, even when it cost her personally. I hadn't expected to hear those words spoken aloud in this particular room. They landed harder than I expected, reminding me of choices I'd spent years trying not to revisit. The sacrifices, the friends I'd lost along the way, in one form or another. For a moment, exhaustion settled over me completely, and I wondered whether reopening any of it had truly been worth it. Then I looked toward Grace. She smiled at me, small and steady and certain. I remembered exactly why I was standing there, not to prove who I had been, to protect who she could still become. Nothing further, I said. Vance stood for cross-examination, flipping through his notes for a long moment before asking a single question. Agent Alvarez, did the Colonel ever discuss her personal family matters with you during this period? No, Marcus said. She kept her work and her home life completely separate. That was one of the things I always respected about her. Vance sat back down without asking anything further. Does the respondent have another witness? Whitfield asked. I do, Your Honor. I called Chaplain Elijah Grant. A tall man in his early 60s walked to the stand, silver hair neatly combed, carrying himself with the quiet bearing of someone who had once worn the uniform himself. We'd served together during one of the hardest stretches of my career, and I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 years. He took the oath. It's good to see you again, Chaplain. You too, Colonel. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. I had the sense she was growing tired of hearing that title spoken aloud. How do we know each other? We served together for almost 4 years. What was your role? Senior chaplain assigned to the command. And mine? You were the chief trial counsel. He folded his hands, but that title doesn't tell the whole story. I hadn't asked that question. He'd volunteered it. Vance stood. Objection. On what grounds? Whitfield asked. Vance hesitated. Narrative. Whitfield considered it. I'll allow limited explanation. Thank you, Your Honor. Chaplain Grant looked toward the bench. I've worked alongside hundreds of attorneys over the years. Some were exceptionally talented. Some weren't. Colonel Hutchins was different. He paused. I watched her meet with grieving families after difficult trials. I watched her explain complicated rulings to parents who didn't understand military justice. I watched her spend hours helping young Marines find counseling after they testified in cases that would haunt them for years. His voice remained steady. People assume prosecutors care most about winning. Diane never saw it that way. She believed justice wasn't about defeating someone. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't expected that. Honestly, I wasn't sure I'd earned it. The chaplain's expression softened. One evening, after a particularly difficult case, I found her sitting alone outside the chapel. I asked if she wanted to pray. She said no. A few soft laughs moved through the gallery. Then she asked if I'd sit there with her anyway. That's who she is, he continued, quiet, private, but never uncaring. No further questions. As he stepped down, I noticed Grace watching him with wide, careful eyes. Later I would realize she was learning things about me she'd never known, not because I'd hidden them from her deliberately, but because she'd simply been too young, until now, to understand them. She was beginning to see the woman behind the word mom. That mattered more than anything else happening in that courtroom. Vance rose for cross-examination and asked 2 brief, careful questions that went nowhere. He sat back down. Vance stood for what would become his final argument. To his credit, he didn't overreach. He acknowledged that I had provided a safe home. He admitted Grace clearly loved me. He conceded there was no evidence of abuse, neglect, addiction, or financial misconduct. Instead, he argued that Eleanor and Walter simply believed they could offer Grace a stronger extended family environment. It was a reasonable-sounding argument. It just wasn't supported by the facts. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium without notes. I didn't need them. Your Honor, I've spent most of my adult life asking courts to look past emotion and examine evidence. This case deserves the same respect. I took a slow breath. My in-laws loved my husband. I've never questioned that. They love Grace. I don't question that either. I looked briefly toward Eleanor. They lost a son. I lost my husband. Grace lost her father. Grief doesn't belong to only one side of this room. The courtroom stayed completely still. But grief doesn't give any of us permission to rewrite reality. I gestured toward the exhibits stacked on my table. The evidence shows I encouraged contact again and again, even when it wasn't returned. It shows Grace is healthy. It shows she succeeds in school. It shows she has friends, a community, a counselor she trusts. It shows she is loved consistently by the person who has never once missed a single day of raising her. I paused. My military career isn't why I should keep custody of my daughter. It simply explains why I stayed calm when accusations were made against me. I'm not asking this court to reward me for my service. I'm asking it to let my daughter continue growing up in the only stable home she's ever known. I looked toward Grace one last time. That's all. For several long minutes, Whitfield reviewed his notes in silence. No one in the gallery moved. Finally, he removed his glasses and set them on the bench. The court is prepared to rule. Every heartbeat in the room seemed louder than the last. This case is not about wealth, he began. It is not about military service. It is not about social standing. It is about the best interests of one child. He removed a small stack of index cards from beneath the docket, glancing at them only briefly before setting them aside, as though he'd already decided he didn't need them. I want to note for the benefit of everyone in this room that a colonel's insignia and a chief trial counsel's caseload do not, by themselves, prove fitness to parent. They never should. What proves fitness to parent is what this court heard today. A stable home, a thriving child, a pattern of consistent invitations extended and repeatedly declined by the petitioners, and not one shred of evidence suggesting harm, neglect, or instability of any kind. He reviewed the evidence point by point, school records, counseling reports, witness testimony, the text message exchanges, the financial statements. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. Under North Carolina law, when a biological parent has not been shown to be unfit, that parents' decisions are presumed to be in the best interest of the child. To overcome that presumption, a petitioner must present clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. The petitioners here have failed to establish that Colonel Hutchins is an unfit parent. He paused. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates the opposite. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The petition for custody is denied. I closed my eyes for just 1 second, not in triumph, in relief. Whitfield continued. The court also finds that the request for appointment of a financial conservator is not properly before this court and is, in any event, unsupported by any evidence of financial mismanagement. That request is denied as well. He looked toward Vance. Counsel, I want to note for the record that several of the exhibits presented on behalf of the petitioners were incomplete in ways that materially misrepresented the underlying communications. I trust that going forward, greater diligence will be exercised before allegations of this nature are brought before this court. I am ordering the petitioners to reimburse a substantial portion of the respondent's court costs, and I am referring the conduct of counsel in this matter for further review by the appropriate bar committee. Vance's face went rigid, but he said nothing. This isn't a punishment, Whitfield added, more quietly. It's accountability. The gavel came down. This matter is concluded. Outside the courthouse, late afternoon sunlight caught the windows across the street. A few local reporters had gathered near the steps, apparently drawn by word of an unusual hearing. One approached me as I walked out with Grace in Major Park. Colonel Hutchins, may I ask you one question? Of course. Why didn't you ever tell your husband's family that you were a colonel? I looked over toward Grace, who was laughing while Duke, freshly picked up from the neighbor's house, chased a squirrel across the courthouse lawn with far more enthusiasm than speed. Because rank isn't who you are, I said. It's just a job you once had. What mattered most to me was being Rob's wife. I smiled. And now, it's being Grace's mother. The reporter thanked me and stepped aside. As we reached the parking garage, I heard someone call my name. Diane. I turned. Eleanor stood several yards away, looking smaller somehow. Not physically. Something else. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to win anything. She walked over slowly. I owe you an apology. I waited. I spent 3 years believing things that weren't true. Tears filled her eyes. I was angry. I needed someone to blame. She looked down at her hands. And blaming you was easier than accepting that I couldn't have saved my son. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, I nodded. I know. She looked up, surprised. You know? I've known for a long time, Eleanor. that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. I know that too. Another silence stretched between us, less sharp than the ones that had come before. Then she looked toward Grace. May I call her sometime? I softened. You never had to ask. Eleanor's shoulders dropped as if she'd been carrying something unbearably heavy for far too long. Maybe she had. We weren't suddenly one happy family. Real life doesn't work that way. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single conversation outside a parking garage. It returns slowly. Phone call by phone call, birthday by birthday, small choices repeated over time until they mean something again. The first phone call came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Grace with a history project spread across the kitchen table. My phone lit up with Eleanor's name, and for a moment I just looked at it, unsure whether to answer. I answered. I don't want anything, Eleanor said quickly, before I could even say hello. I just wanted to hear how Grace's week was going. It was such a small thing to ask. It had taken her 3 years in a courtroom to learn how to ask it. She got an A on her science test, I told her, and she's decided she wants to try out for the volleyball team in the spring. She always did love running around, Eleanor said, and I could hear something loosen in her voice, something that had been braced tight for a very long time. Robert was the same way at that age. Couldn't sit still through a single dinner. He never really outgrew that, I said. Neither of us said anything for a moment, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the kind of silence two people can sit inside together without either one needing to fill it. Thank you for answering, Eleanor said eventually. Thank you for calling instead of assuming, I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, not yet. But it was a door left open instead of one slammed shut, and after 3 years of the opposite, that felt like more than enough to build on. Walter called a week after that, awkward in the way men of his generation often are when the conversation drifts anywhere near feeling. He asked Mosley about Duke, oddly enough, whether the old lab still chased squirrels he had no realistic chance of catching, and I told him yes, every single time, with total conviction and 0 results. He laughed at that, a real laugh. The first I'd heard from him in years, and for a moment he sounded exactly like Rob. He got that from you, Walter said quietly. The laugh. Rob had it too. I know, I said. I hear it sometimes and it still catches me off guard. Me too, Walter admitted, and neither of us needed to say anything more than that. 6 months later, Eleanor sat quietly in the second row of the auditorium for Grace's 7th grade choir concert. Walter sat beside her, holding a small bouquet of flowers he seemed unsure what to do with until the concert ended. Afterward, Eleanor hugged Grace first, then hugged me. It was awkward, a little stiff, and completely genuine. Craig came too, though he stayed near the back, and when I caught his eye across the room, he gave me a small tired nod that said more than any apology could have. As for me, I went back to my work with the Veterans Nonprofit, sitting across from young Marines and sailors who believed their lives had fallen apart over a single mistake, or a single bad diagnosis, or a single benefits denial letter. I'd listen. I'd offer whatever practical help I could. I'd remind them that today's setback didn't have to define tomorrow. In many ways, I was telling myself the same thing every time I said it to them. One young corporal came to see me that autumn, barely 22, sitting across from my desk with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He'd been denied a benefits claim after an injury the VA didn't believe was service-connected, and he was convinced the system had already decided he didn't matter. They don't see people like us, he said. They just see paperwork. I thought about Eleanor, about 17 invitations declined without a second thought, about a whole family that had spent 3 years mistaking silence for something worth punishing. I thought about how easy it is for anyone, institutions and grandmothers alike, to build a version of a person out of assumptions instead of asking a single honest question. They saw paperwork because that's all you gave them, I told him gently. Let's build the case properly this time. Every record, every witness, every document that tells the truth instead of leaving room for someone else's guess. He looked at me like I'd handed him something solid to stand on for the first time in months. We won that appeal 4 weeks later. It wasn't a courtroom victory with a gallery watching. No reporters waited outside. But watching his shoulders drop with relief when the letter arrived reminded me why I'd stayed in this line of work at all. Long after the uniform came off, Rebecca Ford still teases me sometimes about representing myself. You do know, she said once over coffee a few weeks after the hearing, that most people would have hired me anyway. Most people didn't spend 17 years learning how to do exactly what you do, I told her. Fair point. Marcus Alvarez retired fully the following spring, and he still calls every few months, mostly to talk about fishing and almost never about the past. Chaplain Grant sends a card every Christmas with the same handwriting he's had since I met him. Denise still borrows sugar from me, and I still borrow her shop back. And Judge Whitfield, I never did confirm directly whether he remembered me from that legal review board years earlier, or whether it truly was as he'd once quietly mentioned to Rebecca in the hallway after the ruling. Simply a matter of two people whose careers had crossed paths long enough ago that recusal was never seriously in question. I decided it didn't matter which explanation was true. What mattered was that the ruling stood on the evidence, not on the memory, and every piece of that evidence had come from years of showing up quietly and doing the work, long before anyone in that courtroom knew my name. Grace asked me about that morning once, almost a year later, while we were driving home from a soccer game. She'd grown taller over the months, less inclined to sit quietly beside a family readiness officer doing math worksheets, more inclined to ask the kinds of questions that catch a parent off guard at 50 miles an hour on a two-lane road. "Were you scared?" she asked. That morning, walking in alone, I thought about how to answer that honestly, the way I'd promised myself I always would with her, no matter how uncomfortable the truth felt. "Yes," I said, terrified actually. I just didn't let it show. "How do you do that?" "Practice," I said. 24 years of it, and it helps to know exactly what you're standing on before you walk into a room. If the evidence is solid, the fear doesn't get to decide what happens next. It just gets to come along for the ride. She considered that for a while. Watching the pine trees blur past the window, I want to be like that someday. You already are, I told her, and I meant it more than she probably understood at 12. You've been like that since the day your grandmother stood up in that courtroom and you didn't flinch. You just watched and you waited and you trusted that the truth would hold up. That's the whole job, Grace. That's all any of it ever really was. She reached over and turned up the radio, embarrassed, the way 12-year-olds get embarrassed by their mother saying something true and tender in the front seat of a car, and I let her, because some lessons land better once they've had a little quiet to settle in. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have explained clearly on the morning I walked into that courthouse alone. Revenge was never what I wanted, and it wasn't what satisfied me in the end. The satisfaction came from refusing to become the person grief expected me to become. It came from letting the truth do the work anger never could have done as cleanly. The truth didn't need noise to win. It only needed patience, preparation, and the courage to stand quietly until someone was finally ready to listen. If this story stayed with you, I hope it reminds you that dignity often speaks far louder than pride ever could. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if you'd like to hear another true-to-life story about resilience, I'd be grateful to have you back. Rank isn't who you are. It never was. It's just a job you once had, and the people who love you were never waiting for the title. They were only ever waiting for you.